Welcome to Empire State Engagements. I'm Dr. Robert Childs. During the Great Migration, a community of African American migrants from Mississippi were able to reestablish themselves on the outskirts of Albany. Dr. Jennifer Lemak tells the fascinating story of the Rapp Road Community in her wonderful book, Southern Life, Northern City. I spoke with Dr. Lemak about her research, about her experiences as a UAlbany grad student, and about her ongoing wonderful work as the Chief Curator of History at the New York State Museum.
This is actually the job I went to school for. So when I tell people I have my dream job, I'm not lying. I really do. I am so incredibly fortunate to have this job that I love.
Welcome to Empire State Engagements. I am absolutely ecstatic to be joined today by a longtime colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Jennifer Lemak. Dr. Lemak is Chief Curator of History at the New York State Museum. She has produced amazing work for the museum, including recently curating the widely celebrated centennial exhibition of women's voting in New York State, Votes for Women, as well as authoring, along with Ashley Hopkins Benton, the catalog of the same title. She has put together other books on behalf of the museum, including, among others, An Irrepressible Conflict, which is also an excellent look at New York State in the Civil War years. Currently, she is 1/3 of the editorial troika of New York History Journal, which of course we encourage everyone watching this to subscribe and read. And her first book, which will be the focus of our conversation today, is entitled Southern Life, Northern City, which is published by SUNY Press, Excelsior Editions, and which I am really excited to talk about today. So welcome, Jennifer.
Thanks, Rob. Nice to be here.
Well, this story is a story of a really unique, I guess, micro-migration within this broader national phenomenon over many decades of the Great Migration. And so I guess starting out, how are the experiences of the Rapp Road community in a very broad sense? How do they fit into larger trends in the Great Migration in these years?
Well, they fit in actually perfectly because the Rapp Road folks, and we'll get into how and why they came to Albany and where they came from. But the Rapp Road folks were moved here in a chain migration fashion, and migrants around the country would go to some place where they knew there were already family and friends established. That was probably the biggest indicator of why somebody would go somewhere, because they already knew people living there, and it was kind of a safe zone, if you will, to have that kind of those comforts of home and have relations. And so you weren't completely venturing out into a brand new area, but because you had kin there. So that was pretty common. And you see that in big cities across the North. In fact, in places like Chicago and Detroit, there would be full little communities inside the larger city, all from a specific area in the Deep South. And Albany was no different. So the one thing that was different about this migration, because most of the migrants came from Shubuta, Mississippi and the surrounding areas, is that it's difficult to get from Shubuta, Mississippi to Albany. Most migrations would go in a specific north-south pattern. And because Shubuta is a little more west than most of the other migrants who came to Albany, it was unusual. Because doing census research, I found that most of the heads of households were from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. But Mississippi definitely made an impact on Albany, New York.
Absolutely, and it's such a rich story that you describe of this interesting connection between Shubuta, Mississippi and Albany, New York. And of course, the spark of that connection was this dynamic clergyman we'll meet in a couple of minutes, Louis Parson. And he believed that God had led him to Albany, and then he in turn would lead a lot of his fellow Mississippians to Albany. But he, as you point out, was, when he showed up in 1927, coming to a city that already had an African-American population, and they weren't mostly, as you point out, Mississippians. So before we start with the Mississippi migration, what was life like in Albany, and especially what was African-American life like in Albany in the years when Parson and others started arriving?
Sure. So there was, in the 19th century, there was a small established African-American community here. But then starting with the Great Migration, when African-Americans were hired in large numbers for the first time in Northern industry, it started to grow. And folks did move to Albany because it was a headquarters of the Delaware and Hudson and the New York Central Railroads. So there were jobs available here. There were a few industries, Albany Felt and the Utopian Packing Company, and the Waterville Arsenal hired African Americans during World War II. And then because of the Port of Albany, there was a lot of day work available for recently arrived migrants could go down to the port and get day work. And then as far as women goes, a lot of the women were hired as domestics and laundresses. So it wasn't a huge community. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it definitely increased over the 40s, 50s, and 60s.
And of course, there are, in any migration story, there are push factors as well as pull factors. You point out the pull factors, generally speaking, were potential for work, although with Rapp Road, it's also, as you point out, sort of a chain migration and connections. But what were some of the, I mean, we know, to be rehashing the push factors, it's a well-known and terrible story in U.S. history, but I guess a better question would be, how did life in Albany compare to the world that had been left behind for African Americans as far as education, because you get into this in the book, right? What kind of schools were available, what kind of institutions, work, and so forth. Right.
So if you go by what the secondary sources say, they will tell you that schools in the North were better, and indeed African Americans could make more money per day. I think it was anywhere between $1.50 to $2 a day in Albany versus 50 cents to 75 cents in rural Mississippi. So that alone is better. But when I did oral history interviews, and I did about 3 dozen, Everything didn't go the way the secondary sources said. So when I would talk about, well, was education better in Albany? Yes, you'd get some, well, yes, it was better, but then folks would start to talk about some of the discriminations that happened here in Albany because for the first time they were going to an integrated school. When they were in Mississippi, they went to the Black school, and therefore there was nobody there to show favoritism to. And so they would talk about coming up to Albany, and then they would notice that, you know, all of the awards would go to the white students. And there was this great quote from a woman named Geneva Conway, and it was something to the effect of, there's discrimination in the South, and I knew it for what it was. But when I went north, it kind of sneaks in on you, and it was on me before I knew it. And when she said that, it made such sense. And it was, yes, there's still discrimination here, but it's kind of painted in a rosy picture sometimes. And then you don't know about it until it really happens. And I think growing up in that community, in the Black community, folks, you kind of grow into it because the families would all try to shelter their kids as long as possible. And then there would come a time where, well, yep, now you got to learn about the ways of the world. And that's, you know, sad no matter what family you're in. So, and then there were other instances of folks talking about, in fact, I interviewed a couple gentlemen who moved to Albany and hated the weather, absolutely hated it. And they said they would just go to work, come home, and it was so cold they didn't want to leave their apartments. And then spring rolled around and they decided to move back to Mississippi, which shocked me because I'm like, well, everything says that the South is horrible. Why would you ever move back? But, you know, folks still had families down there. So it wasn't, you know, maybe it wasn't so bad. And God knows Albany winters are terrible, but, you know.
Well, they couldn't do anything about the weather, but the African-American community did organize ways of sort of trying to improve the situation through civic organizations, civil rights organizations. And you talk a lot about this, I think, especially in the second chapter. There's the Interracial Council, there's chapters of national organizations. What were some important groups or important organizations that were able to sort of improve life or fight to improve life, and how did they approach that?
Yeah, so in Albany, I think because it's considered kind of a second tier city, a lot of the civil rights organizations throughout the 20th century were mostly interracial. I think you see kind of all African-American communities in larger cities when there's a big enough Black population to support it. But in Albany, you had the Interracial Council, which really helped with housing issues and employment issues. One of the big issues in Albany was that there was really not a lot of housing stock that was available to African-American migrants upon arrival in town. So the areas that most Black families were kind of stuck living in were the South End and Arbor Hill. And the South End was kind of the place where all of the new arrivals throughout the 19th and 20th century would arrive. It was the kind of the poorest and least desirable section of town. And folks that came here, like Irish and Germans and Jewish, were able to move to the South End, get a job, get established, and then slowly move out of the South End and basically move up Madison Avenue and uptown to nicer apartments and houses in Pine Hills. Versus the African Americans who would move here, and then because of discrimination and racism, there was no other place for them to go. So they were kind of stuck in the South End and really not able to move out and kind of become upwardly mobile like the other groups. And then in the 1950s and 1960s, there was, I think, like one realty that actually dealt with African-American rental properties. And that was the Albert and Kirsch Realty. African-Americans couldn't get a mortgage, so they couldn't go, put a down payment on a house and then move out of the South End. So they were kind of stuck downtown. There were civil rights organizations that sprung up in the 1960s. There was an organization known as the Brothers who worked to kind of worked on housing issues for the African-American community. And they also worked to get slumlords to kind of hold up their end of the bargain because there was so little housing stock. And the folks that owned kind of the properties where African-Americans lived owned multiple properties and did not take care of anything. So African-Americans paid the highest rents and lived in the worst housing stock in the city. So the Brothers, that civil rights group, really worked to try and eradicate that. And then when the South Mall was built, a lot of those, it was known as the gut of Albany, a lot of those houses were destroyed in the building of the South Mall.
So backing up to the late 1920s, you've got this world where African Americans are escaping the Jim Crow South, but they're arriving in Albany. They might have jobs in industry, but they are crammed into undesirable housing on the South End. And that is the world that Lewis W. Parson arrives in 1927. And he didn't initially set out for Albany, but he ended up there, and then he has a plan. And so tell me about this fellow.
So Lewis Parson was a part-time preacher. He was born in, here's another great Mississippi town name, Buckatawna, Mississippi, which was 4 miles away from Shubuta. And he was a part-time preacher, and a rural preacher at that. So he would, on different Sundays of the month, go to another different little rural community and preach there. And then the next Sunday he'd go somewhere else. So he had a kind of a following all around Shubuta, Mississippi. And he was he worked in a logging company, which was a fairly large industry in Shubuta and in Mississippi. And he was hurt on the job, and they gave him insurance settlement. And according to his niece, who I interviewed, he didn't feel comfortable being a Black man and having so much money living in Mississippi. So he bought a car with some of his money, and he and his wife Frances decided to drive north to relocate. And he stopped in Ohio to visit his sister and didn't feel comfortable there. And then he kept coming east. I think he stopped in Buffalo, didn't like it there. And then he came all the way to Albany, and in the South End, he came upon a group of women who were holding prayer circles during the week. And the story goes that he felt a kinship with the women, and they decided to establish a church at 40 Franklin Street in downtown Albany. And that was the establishment of the First Church of God in Christ. So he establishes this little storefront church in Albany. And because he has an automobile, he starts to drive back and forth between Albany and Shubuta, Mississippi, to relocate his congregation members from Mississippi to Albany. And he goes back and forth 3 or 4 times. I have kind of lists of who he brought during each trip, and interviews with some of the folks that actually came here with Parson. And they would try to fill his car up with as many people as possible. They tell stories, the folks tell stories about how they would, they'd only have like an outfit or 2 to wear, and then they would have to put food and provisions in the trunk because they would drive right through. Parson would usually pick them up on a Saturday night because it was expected that they would be in church all day Sunday, so nobody would be looking for them on Sunday. And then that would give them enough time to drive from Mississippi to get past the Mason-Dixon line where they could then take advantage of roadside restaurants and restrooms and whatnot. So I have, great stories of, the trips north and how many people they crammed into the car, and then, their arrival in Albany. So, and then, go ahead.
No, I love the story. Having been a long time driver of a Buick LeSabre, I love the story about putting 17 people in
17 people
at one point.
Yes.
And but it's
a baby.
it's a remarkable series of basically odysseys that he's taking people on, and they establish basically a transplanted Shubuta, and it starts out on the south end, right?
Yep. Yep.
And they're not happy there for obvious reasons, but also it's not just the housing conditions, is it, that trouble them? Life there is
right. So I do want to say that everybody that Parson brings, he takes care of. So they all know people when they arrive in town, and the new arrivals would always stay with established family members and friends already. And then the church folks would actually help them find jobs, and help them find clothing and food if they needed it. The church actually had a little store where you could go and get food if you needed it. So it's actually kind of fantastic how much the church takes care of them. And this is always a kind of a point of contention, because Lewis Parson was issued a summons for bringing folks to Albany, because the city of Albany felt that, Lewis Parson is just bringing these Black people here and they don't have jobs, they have no means of living, and we don't want you to do that anymore. And in reality, if you listen to the folks that actually came here, they were all taken care of by family and friends. They might not have had an apartment right away, but they were taken care of. They lived with, they lived with whoever they needed to until they could get their own apartment and become established. And then they would in turn do that for another family. And then there were some folks that would not wait for Lewis Parson to bring them. I know there was a couple families that actually came on a Greyhound bus, because they had aunts and uncles already established in Albany, and they weren't waiting for Parson to come. They were coming on their own. So so those stories were always fun to listen to as well.
Yeah, you made two really great points that I actually had wanted to bring up anyway, so I'm glad you did. The one that it's a religious institution, but it's this really broad, almost holistic array of social services, especially there, as they're starting to arrive, the Depression is taking place. Mm-hmm. And it's remarkable how they really are able to build up. And the other point that you just mentioned is that the city resents this, and they take notice and they try to stop him. And at one point, I think you say in the book, he's told that he's supposed to be in court. And this dynamo of a community builder says, well, I'm too busy for the judge, right?
Yeah. So he sends his wife to court. And according to the oral history, she sits there and worries the whole day, sits in court the whole day, just waiting for that court summons to be called. And then he's never called on. And then, so they just kind of, it was probably an empty threat to just kind of say, hey, let's stop this. But it was in the records that he was summoned and just never called. So, and then you mentioned earlier about the kind of the environment that they were living in the South End. And in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, the South End of Albany was where the bars were located. There were houses of prostitution. There were gambling halls, and the Rapp Road folks were a deeply religious community, and they didn't dance, they didn't smoke, they didn't wear makeup, or they actually did wear makeup. They didn't play cards, and they went to church. When I say they went to church, they went to church. They went to church on like Tuesday, Thursday, Friday nights, and all day Sunday. So they were in church a lot. And so the area that they lived you know, a lot of folks, some folks moved back, but they didn't like the environment and all of the vice that was in the South End at the time.
And so the solution is to move to what was referred to at the time as Albany's last frontier.
Right.
And so talk about the Pine Bush, but also this sort of project and this remarkable notion of basically creating this community out there on the fringes of the city.
So Lewis Parson has the idea to he has the opportunity and the idea to purchase land on the very western frontier of Albany. And it's kind of an area, it's an area called the Pine Bush, which is a kind of a pine barren area with tall pine trees and sandy soil, which remarkably is very similar to Shubuta, Mississippi. They had Shubuta, Mississippi in that area in the Mississippi Delta kind of has that sandy soil and pine trees. So Lewis Parson and a fellow church member named Charles Tolliver jointly purchased a 14-acre tract of land out in the middle of the Pine Bush. And the road that went through it was called Rapp Road, after an old German family that lived out in the Pine Bush who had pig farms. So Lewis Parson then decides to sell little plots of that land only to church members. And he doesn't take the money. If the family has the money, that they can just give it to him right away. He takes that, but he takes the money in installments. And so church members buy little tracts of land, some of them buy bigger tracts of land. And then they start building houses and gardens out there and start to kind of create this little community. And it's important to note that only church members are offered land. And then within a few years, Parson's wife and Parson both buy another 14-acre tract of land. So they've got 28 acres out in the middle of the Pine Bush, which is completely rural. It's about 5 miles from downtown Albany. And it's probably about a mile to the last bus. So if anybody wants to come to downtown Albany, they either have to have a car or they walk, or they have got to walk about a mile to the bus stop, and then they can take the bus straight down Western Avenue. But some families, one family actually, the Woodards, had a garden out on Rapp Road. They kept their apartment in downtown Albany and then just gardened out on Rapp Road until they had enough money to save up to start building their home. And then slowly homes get built and established, and then families move out there and start to, live pretty much a rural life again, because there is really no development around the area. And if you were to, and when I keep on saying development, right now, Rapp Road is very close to the Thruway. The University of Albany is right next door. Crossgates Mall is on another side. So currently there is a lot of development all around Rapp Road, but there is a little core set of houses there now. And then there are some other developments around it, or housing developments around it. But I think between 1933 and 1963, 23 families built houses and moved out to the Rapp Road community. And for the longest time, either nobody cared or nobody realized that this community was even out there, because I've over the years heard some great stories about when Washington Avenue Extension first went out in 1971. Folks who live out there would tell these stories, like cars would see these little houses and they'd be driving through and they were just like jaw dropped open, what are these Black people doing out there? who are these people? And then in the newspaper, I think in the late 70s, it finally did like the first kind of article about this group of Black people living in the middle of the pine bush, in true 1970 fashion. So
It's really fascinating. As you're speaking, I hadn't thought about it too much before, but New York State, other parts of the state farther west, have a long tradition of having in the 19th century these sort of perfect communities, these utopian communities, and not too far from Albany, right? There are
yeah,
Shakers, which is an example.
yeah.
Is this in some ways because of its centered on a church, on a particularly I think we can say particularly committed group of church members and its isolation, at least for a while? Is this sort of a 20th century version of that?
I, in a lot of respects, yes. There are stories about how the women who stayed home would have prayer circles every day. Um, and then the kids that weren't quite yet ready to go to school would get stuck being dragged to the prayer circle. And so they all tell stories about kind of the different religious aspects of growing up out there. Um, and then they talk about how starting in, I think maybe in the 50s, they start having a Rapp Road kind of homecoming reunion every year, which is actually fantastic. It's been going on since then. Last year in 2020 was the first time they did not physically do a reunion in almost 60 years. But they did it, virtually. But yeah, I think for a while it was, kind of a perfect community, at least for them, because it was so rare at that point in time in the 1940s and 50s, and 60s even, that African Americans in New York State could own land and have a house. That was just almost unheard of in most of the urban centers. And in a lot of ways, they were able to live a rural life in the city of Albany, because they're technically considered, city of Albany, even though they were out in the middle of nowhere. So yeah, it's a very special place, and it doesn't look like anything you've ever seen before in New York State.
And not only a rural life in Albany, but also, as the title suggests, a southern life in New York State. You said even before they created the community that the church became the place where its members could somewhat continue their southern lifestyle while living in the north. And then once they established Rapp Road, my goodness, it seems as though there's a sort of, at times, a fusion of their southern culture, lifestyles, architectural styles with their new northern environment. So talk about how Mississippi life, without the things they were trying to flee from Mississippi, how many elements of that really were transplanted up into this region?
Well, the church was the biggest one. And their church was definitely a holiness and Pentecostal church. And it came, lock, stock, and barrel from Mississippi, same preacher, just transplanted here. And then the other aspects of their life were, they weren't exactly Southern per se, but they were rural. In Mississippi, everybody, families canned all of, they grew and they preserved their food, they hunted. When they moved to the south end of Albany, a lot of the folks were not used to going to the grocery store for everything. And then when they moved back out, when they moved to Rapp Road, they could have gardens, they could hunt, they hunted turkeys and deer. They had pigs and cows out there. If you think about that, in the city of Albany, folks actually had livestock, and they had that actually quite late. Really, actually way into the 70s, they got livestock out there, chickens. So they were able to recreate this rural existence. And then some of their social customs, like homecoming, they brought with them. One of the most fascinating. First time I ever heard of the Rapp Road Community, the community leader at the time, Emma Dixon, was giving a Black History Month program at one of the junior high schools. And I went to it, and I just remember sitting there thinking, like, and she said the word Shubuta, and I remember going like, oh my God, what is this? What is that word? What are all these? And I just remember looking around the auditorium. I'm like, what are all these people doing here? This is Albany. It's hard, Mississippi. It makes no sense to me. And then they showed a photo, which really kind of blew my mind, of full immersion baptisms in the Hudson River. And I was just like, this is different. So, and it was just very matter of fact. This is the way we do things. And so I'll share one of those photos with you. But it was just a matter of fact. This is how we do it. And we do it on the Rensselaer side because that's the shallow side. So, and it was just so matter of fact. And, just seeing that image of the folks getting baptized in the river, and I was like, wow, this is something special. This is something completely different. I need to know more. So, yeah.
And if I remember correctly, the church itself remained down in the city. Is that right? And
yes.
So the mall actually got, but anyway.
Yep. So the church was originally located at 40 Franklin Street, and then it moved to 79 Hamilton Street, which was then demolished with the building of the South Mall and the Empire State Plaza. And it is currently located at 121 J Street, which is just, I can practically see the church from my museum window. It's right up next to the Empire State Plaza. They moved into an old synagogue, which is an absolutely beautiful church. The church is still intact, still, they don't celebrate, they don't go to church as much as they used to, but they are still there quite a bit. And I should say that there was also Lewis Parson recruited a successor. Lewis Parson passes away in 1940, I believe. And his wife goes on to sell many of the tracts of land out on Rapp Road. But before he passed away, Lewis Parson recruited a man by the name of Jack Johnson, who ends up purchasing a bus to drive back and forth between Albany and Shubuta and other places in Mississippi to bring migrants up to Albany. So all of the folks who came from Mississippi or who have ties to Mississippi, I would say a majority of them go to Wilbourn Temple or Jack Johnson's church, which is still in the South End, but not everybody moved to Rapp Road. There were only 23 families that moved out there. But there are, I would love to know what the actual number of folks who live in Albany and are connected, are from Mississippi, because there must be thousands. Every September, they actually have a Mississippi Day in the South End, and folks come out of the woodwork from everywhere. And there is really some cosmic connection between Shubuta, Mississippi, and Albany, New York.
It's a really fascinating story because it seems that in your book, it comes all the way up to the present. And so it's now generations of people bringing Mississippians and Shubutans in particular to Albany. Parson has Reverend Johnson, and then his son McKinley Johnson, I think, continues it. And through all this time, for a while, as you point out, Rapp Road was sort of shrouded in distance and obscurity, and that was to their benefit. But I think you said in your book that it only comes up once in all of Mayor Corning's papers, and he was mayor for what, 40 years, something like that. But that was to their advantage, all things considered. But then people started eyeing the region for development. You mentioned a few minutes ago, by the early 70s is the Western Avenue extension. Later on, Crossgates Mall. You've mentioned all the other development in that region. How were they able to weather this sudden, unfortunate attention that was being turned on their part of Albany?
Yeah, so I should say that for the longest time, nobody really understood why they were out there. And the rumors around town were, oh, those are just pig farmers out in the pine bush. Or, oh no, Mayor Corning put them out there just to get them out of the city, like all-knowing Mayor Corning. And so the woman that I started working with, Emma Dixon, said that she started hearing these rumors growing up, because she grew up on Rapp Road, and once she moved away, she moved to downtown a little bit when she was a young adult. And they would say, well, where did you grow up? And she'd say Rapp Road, and then she'd hear these rumors about it. So she was the first one that really wanted to know, like, why are we out here? So I give her a lot of credit, because she was the one that really started asking those first generation folks, like, well, why did you come here? And what was it like when you moved here? What was it like, building your house from scratch? So she was really the first one that kind of got it going. And I give her a lot of credit, because when there was a plan in the 80s and 90s, late 80s and 90s, for the Crossgates Mall wanted to double the size of it now. And it's a pretty big mall, but they had a plan to double the size. And they started to slowly buy up pieces of land between houses. And she was convinced that they were going to just slowly buy everybody out and then connect all the pieces. And they were able to get some of the community where Washington Avenue extension split the community in half, and folks had the choice to either sell their property or move it. And a couple of them actually moved their homes to the current side of Washington Avenue extension, the community side now. And then others sold and moved away. So there was this plan, and the thinking was, I would assume on the part of Crossgates, that, this Black community, we could probably buy them out fairly cheaply. But they refused to sell, they refused to move. Emma Dixon and some of the community members would go to the planning meetings. And what's interesting about Rapp Road is that they are in the city of Albany, but right next door where Crossgates Mall is, and Crossgates Mall is directly right next door, literally. Crossgates Mall is in the city of is in the town of Guilderland. So they would have to go to City of Albany meetings, they have to go to Guilderland town planning meetings, and they were always there. And eventually the plans for the double mall, the expansion, fell through, and they were kind of safe. And I entered the community's history, I guess, right around the tail end of the Crossgates expansion movement, because I needed to do a research paper for graduate school. And I worked at the Albany Institute of History and Art at the time. And so I went to the history curator there, and I said, I have to do a paper on African-American history. Do you have any ideas, something that needs to be researched? And he gave me a list of ideas. And then the last one, he said, well, there's this community out in the pine bush. And he kind of explained it briefly. He's like, but there's not been anything done. And you would have to, do some oral history interviews. And right within like a week or two of me kind of hearing that was when Emma Dixon was giving the Black History Month talk at the local school. And I just decided to go and listen to it just to hear about it. And then after listening to her talk about her family's history, I was hooked. I was like, this is so fascinating. I can't even, this thing is just so unlike anything I've ever experienced. I have to know more. And I went up to Emma at the end of the talk and said, I'm a graduate student. I would love to do a research paper. And she said, well, you give me a call. I said, okay. So I called her. And at this point, the community was very territorial because of all of the Crossgates business. And she told me that right up front. She just said, folks are not going to talk to you because of Crossgates or whatever. They don't know you. You're white. We don't know you from anything. I said, okay. And she said, come back next week. So I came back and I just kept showing up. And then finally, we realized that I need to do a research paper and she would like to get her community on the historic registry. And so we both kind of came to the conclusion that both of those things can work for each other. And then once that happened, she said, okay, so I would show up at her house. I interviewed her first, and then I interviewed her sister. And she was a family of 8. And I interviewed her oldest sister, who was born in Mississippi and remembered living there. And then Emma was the last of the 8, and she was born here in Albany. Actually, and her family still lived in the South End. And then I think she moved to Rapp Road when she was like 2. So I interviewed both of them. And I think she realized that I wasn't going to, run off and go to sell everything to Crossgates or anything. So I would show up at her house where she ran a daycare, and we would figure out who to interview. And she would say, okay, well, if you interview this person, they came here because of this reason. So I would show up and she would call them up on the phone and she would say, Jennifer's here. You're going to talk to him. She's coming over to your house right now and you're going to answer her questions. And we need this because of this. And every time I would show up, and we did probably 6 or 7 interviews like that. And then word got out and I did a couple church programs, and I would go down to the church and Emma and I would present together. And it took a long time for me to keep showing up. And I would say it probably took 3 or 4 years for me to earn everybody's trust that I wasn't writing a book to make money. If we get all of this down on paper and we document everything that happens, that's a good thing, because this is something special here, and we want you to be part of the historical record. So that took a long time, and then once I was in it, I had people calling me with stories and whatnot and photos. It took me forever to get photos of anything. And then finally, it kind of dawned on us after Emma and I both would ask for photos constantly. And then it kind of dawned on us and she goes, I don't think anybody had a camera out here. I was like, you're right. So, having a camera was a big deal, and nobody really had a camera until like 1955. Otherwise, every other photos that we had were all professional photos. So it was hard until 1955, I think, is the earliest photos we've uncovered from Rapp Road. So, and I feel like I'm all over the place now.
No, I love it. I think it's such a fascinating story. First of all, Emma Dixon herself is sort of, if Lewis Parson is the dynamic force behind creating this community, it's she who first is able to help it endure, and then help it, as you point out, become historically recognized and eventually.
Absolutely.
And then also just the absolute serendipity of being a graduate student looking for a project and meeting this woman who is working on a history project of her own, of her community. And what must that have been like as a grad student? To end up being plunged into the middle of this, not only rich, untapped historical story, but also this important I would say social justice initiative.
Yeah. At the time, I think about that often because I wonder if I would be able to, I would hope that I would be able to do it again. But I think one of the reasons why it worked so well was because I had no idea what I was doing. And I know I probably shouldn't say that. I need to be a little more academic than that. But
Not at all.
honestly, I remember, showing up with to visit Emma, and I would say, we really have to go look at these deeds. We got to go. We got to do a deed research. And she was like, well, how do we do that? Where do we go? And I'm like, I think we go downtown to City Hall. And so I was like, well, do you want to come with me? She's like, yeah. So I'm like, I don't know what we're doing, but come with me. So we would do the research together, which was so much better because then I could sit there and say, well, who's this person? And she would know who it was. And so we both learned from each other. And I think if I were kind of a slick, established historian who knew exactly what I was doing, I might have been a little off-putting. And because of that, I could see them not wanting to talk to me and open up as much as they did. So I think it was, let's learn this together. And it ended up working. And we actually had the opportunity, I won a Initiatives for Women research grant from the University at Albany and was able to go do research with Emma. I took, because I had so much grant money, was able to take Emma and her oldest sister, Gurley, and we went down to Shubuta, Mississippi and did interviews and did some research. And then I think once we did that trip together, it was like, oh, you got to meet Jennifer. She's been to Shubuta. So it worked out. So I think a lot of it was probably personality, and they are just lovely, lovely people. So.
Well, what is it like as a young historian to sort of see the reality of where people you're writing about had been, obviously out in Rapp Road, but also going to Shubuta, I presume, seeing the red well,
Yeah.
seeing what life was like. There's a
It
certain
was so much fun.
right?
It really was fascinating. And it took a little while because I was used to doing research here and newspaper and records and document research here in Albany. And then I went and did research in Shubuta, and then I realized like there is this whole half of the population that's not being reported on. And it took me a few days to realize like, wait a minute, what's going on? Why? Because if you just look at the newspaper, you would not know that any Black people lived in town. So that took a little kind of adjustment. But then as I started talking to folks, you kind of realize like, oh yeah, there's this whole other history, but you have to kind of talk to people to understand and to actually learn what it is. So that was kind of eye-opening for me coming from, I was born in New York State. So that was completely different.
And this eventually became not only a fine book, but also this work contributed to a museum exhibition. Is that right?
Yep. We did a couple exhibitions, and I learned a lot about community history. So we did our first exhibit was at the Tenbrook Mansion, which is also the Albany County Historical Society, and we had a nice display. It was part of a kind of a community history. It was one little section in a bunch of different neighborhood type things with Albany. And folks from Rapp Road came and they came to the exhibition. And then it was after the exhibit was mounted, somebody said, oh, well, I have this and I have this hat and I've got this and that. And so because of that, they realized like once they saw their history on display, it made sense. And it was probably because I didn't know what I was doing. And I probably didn't ask the right questions when I say, well, what artifacts do you have? If you came to me and said that, even though I'm a curator, I'd be like, well, what do you mean? I don't have any artifacts. So, but once they saw things on display, they understood then what I really was looking for. And I did a fellowship here at the State Museum and to write my dissertation on Rapp Road. And at the tail end of that, we did a exhibition, and that one went a lot smoother because I knew what I was doing a little bit more, but the community also was much more forthcoming with artifacts, just because we all understood at that point what I was looking for. So
that's a remarkable story of getting buy-in, which was absolutely necessary from a community that's been so insular and then besieged by outsiders. And so your work as this, you know, enterprising brand new historian it's a remarkable part of this story, in my view, as someone reading and appreciating the work now. And ultimately it was your dissertation and then became the book.
And I still work with the Rapp Road. They now have a Rapp Road Historical Society, which is great. And they asked me if I could serve on the board, and unfortunately I can't because of my current position. But if anybody from Rapp Road calls me, they know that I will, you know, I love them. So they are stuck with me for a very long time.
It's a wonderful connection. The question I like to ask guests about the history that they are studying and have studied is if people watching this are traveling in New York State, if they're traveling in Albany and they wanted to experience this in some way, obviously you don't want people just wandering around somebody's neighborhood. So how could people in a public history sense, obviously the best answer is probably read the book, but could they go to the church? Like, where would you visit if you were in Albany, you wanted to understand?
You can actually drive through Rapp Road. Okay. I wouldn't suggest walking through Rapp Road, just because it is a cutover from two major roadways in Albany, and it is quite developed around it. But they have a historical marker on Rapp Road now. It was designated both on the state and national registry in 2003, which is kind of special. But you can, if you drive through it, there is a different feeling. The houses don't look the same as the other ones in Albany. And you can kind of see the ghosts of the rural area around. And it's a special place. So if you're ever in Albany, I suggest you Google Rapp Road and then drive through the community, because it's special.
Absolutely. This came out of your dissertation, and it's a sort of extraordinary contribution. What kind of advice would you give, since this is coming from your sort of grad school, starting at least in your grad school years? Not every grad student is going to be able to affect state historical policy and help elevate such a story, but to those who are interested in engaging with oral history, engaging with community histories, with people who are still trying to get their communities recognized, what sort of advice, growing out of your experiences, could you offer?
I would say be earnest and be nice. I mean, being nice and polite goes such a long way. And I mean, and there were folks that didn't want to talk to me, but I kept showing up, and eventually they did, for whatever reason. But I honestly, I think if your intent is good and it's for the documentation, if you think about the history and you're there to help document and get whoever on the historical record, that is, you know, that's a great thing. It's a nice thing. And, you know, I think my best advice is to be, you know, to be polite and, you know, don't do it for reasons of becoming famous. You know, keep in mind keep in mind your intent. I think is the best course of action.
That's wonderful.
And it takes time. I mean, it's not a quick you don't get in and get out. It took me years. And I still am kind of I still collect the history. So
It's a wonderful story, and as I said, an important and very rich contribution for which I'm grateful. And when we're finally all back together again, I hope you'll sign this for me.
absolutely.
I want to ask, so now, many years later, you are the Chief Curator of History at the New York State Museum, and at the time of this recording, we're still in a global pandemic, and your institution and many others are facing, first of all, you're not open to the public, but facing all sorts of other challenges. I'm wondering what kind of effect this has had on the work, the very important work, which everyone has heard me talk about a lot, of the museum.
Yeah. So the work of the museum still goes on, even though we're not open. People are still donating collections. We're still doing research from the places we can do research. A lot of it is kind of shifted to sources we can get online at the moment. And, you know, we've been almost closed a year now. It's hard to believe, but we've used the opportunity of being closed to kind of clean up the exhibit floor. So things have been painted and labels have been replaced. We've actually installed a couple murals, actually 3 different murals. So when the museum does reopen, there will be some new features on the floor, which is nice. So, but the work always continues. We have over 5 million history artifacts in the collection. So there is always a backlog of things to do. And I've been, so thankful that I've been able to come to work through most of this pandemic. It's been a nice respite from working from home. I'd rather work at the museum. So, and it's not, this is actually the job I went to school for. So when I tell people I have my dream job, I'm not lying. I really do. I am so incredibly fortunate to have this job that I love. And every morning I walk into the building, I'm in the main lobby, and I'm just like, I can't believe I have this job.
Well,
so,
I think anybody who's been there, I think, will join me in being thankful that you do, because every time I've visited, which has been dozens of times, it's just a fantastic institution, and that makes me a little bit curious about what might be next. What are you working on research-wise, and what is the museum?
So I have been kind of doing initial research on Mark Twain in Elmira, or Samuel Clemens. And I grew up in Elmira, New York, and his in-laws were all from Elmira, the Langdons. And in thinking about the Langdon family and kind of the effect the Langdons had on Mark Twain, and this is all pre-research. It's kind of just initial thoughts from kind of knowing different players from knowing the local history. But I would posit that the Langdons had, because they were a reformist family and an abolitionist family, that they probably had a bigger impact on Mark Twain and his writing than other places would like to give Elmira credit for. So, New York State in the 19th century was, a leader of reform movements. And Elmira is kind of it's in the southern tier and not too far from where a lot of these, huge reform movements were happening: abolition, education reform. Elmira College was the first college in the nation to offer a curriculum equal to that of men. So Elmira in the 19th century was very forward thinking. So I would like to research kind of that progressive effect on Mark Twain. And he wrote many of his books at the Langdon family home. The Mark Twain and his family would come to Elmira every summer. And Mark Twain's sister-in-law built him a study for him to go and write and smoke his cigars away from the house and the kids. So he wrote for 20 years, and some of his best work was written in the summers at Elmira. So that's what I'm hoping to do. We'll see. It might come to an article. I hope it comes to an article in the New York History Journal, in a possible exhibit. I think it would make an interesting exhibit here at the museum because Twain lived in Buffalo as well. He did a lot of things in the Adirondacks, and then there's the whole publishing aspect of it in New York City, as well as Elmira. So we could get in a full state story, and Mark Twain is one of the big ones.
Absolutely. So. Connecticut's been hogging him long enough.
Exactly.
Well, to me, I guess this isn't very academic, but whenever I think of, I didn't know you were from Elmira, first of all, so that's exciting. There used to be a foundry somewhere in Elmira that made fire hydrants, among other things. And so,
American La France.
Well, on the way into my daughter's elementary school, we'd pass a fire hydrant that said Elmira, New York on it. And if she was having if she was feeling blue, I would invoke the only Elmira reference I knew, which is the line in It's a Wonderful Life when the bank examiner is getting irritated and he looks grumpily at Jimmy Stewart and he says, I want to spend Christmas in Elmira with my family. And so I would do that and Sarah would smile and then we'd go off. So
yes, I know
that's not as erudite an Elmira connection as Mark Twain's or yours, but
yeah. Well, when I first started here, one of the other curators, Jeff Stein, who worked here for almost 50 years, was also from Elmira. So we joked that like 30% of the curatorial staff is from Elmira, New York.
It's had a great influence on a great institution. Well, Jennifer, I'm so glad that you joined us today on Empire.
Well, thank you very much.
And when Mark Twain or anything else is ready for more detail, I'd love for you to come back and talk with us again.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rob.